Thank you, everyone, for coming. This is fun. So I guess I'll be honest about something to start. I actually am not very good at selling, which is interesting given that executive search is really about selling people. And what I realized, especially when I made partner and I'm the youngest partner in my firm, is that you kind of have to really identify the story that you're going to tell, because people care more about connecting with you more than they want to be sold. And so I think when you think about interviewing and you think about what makes people successful in interviewing, it's not that they're essentially just trying to sell something to you. What they're really trying to do is connect with you and be able to understand what you've done, and then be able to understand if not only what you've done is relevant for them, but also if your story or who you are is going to be relevant for who they are, and that match. And it is kind of like getting married, especially when it comes to early stage companies, because the idea is that the people that they hire are going to be there for the long term. And so what makes people successful in interviewing, and kind of the skills that I think that you should try and develop and use are really the same type of skills that we'd use for almost any type of relative sales or marketing situation that you're going to be in. And it's really demonstrating who you are, what you believe in, how you get things done, and then lastly, what are the values that are important to you. And so how do you do that in a 20-minute meeting with me or 25-minute meeting with me, where I'm asking you to tell me your story? And so there's a couple of ways to go do that. And basically, what it is kind of owning that story from start to finish. That's the one thing that you'll always own pretty much better than everybody is you and what you've done and how you got there. And so what I think maybe makes the most sense to start on is a little bit kind of what I was talking about, what we're looking for, and then what we want to hear. Oh, thank you. And then we can kind of open it up more broadly to how do I do that, or what do I kind of advise people to kind of discuss. Because it's something I had to develop over the course of my career as well, when I started, especially coming out here to San Francisco, pitching VCs about why they should have their companies work with me. And so the key thing is that when you're telling your story, you want to have consistency about all the pieces in your story. So what you did in your first job to your last job should still have the same framework around it. The last one obviously should just have more detail involved. So for me, I started off in New York City after college doing fintech product management search in the middle of a financial recession. Why? Because that was the job that I was able to get. How did I get that job? I had the opportunity to start a practice. What we ended up doing was we brought on some of the 4 or 5 financial data providers that were still looking to really grow during that period, and we helped them convert essentially the research analysts and traders are out of a job into product managers so they could get end users to help them develop their product. And we built a $750,000 practice in our first year. That just there basically would have told me why I went there, what I did, what the result was. And then the next obvious question is, why did I leave? So I left because A, I didn't like contingent search, which is where I began my career. B, the recession in New York City was a rather depressing place to be, and I wanted to move over into retained. So I joined a firm afterwards called CT Partners. That transition basically just said what my motivations are, what my situation was. It gives a personal aspect to me as well, that New York was not a great place for me at the time to live, and I wanted to do something different, but I also had aspirations to take my career in the next direction. So second part of it is obviously the more recent experience, and so I've been doing search for over a decade now. So my last firm was a firm called CT Partners. CT Partners was a Big 5 firm. It got acquired a couple of years ago. I joined that firm as the youngest associate in the history of the firm. I was there for 3 years. Over that period of time, I became the youngest director in the history of that firm. I finished in the top 10, actually in the top 10 globally in searches as an associate and director every year I was there, and then the top 3 in North America. And I was a member of the board and CEO, the technology and cybersecurity, and the professional services practices. Just there in literally 35 to 45 seconds, I basically gave you a full synopsis of 3 years. that opens up a lot of questions for anybody to start asking, okay, what did you work on? What did you do? But it basically also catches someone's attention. And this is what I'd had to basically start telling different venture firms what I was doing, because that was the only way in 30, 45 seconds they're gonna get some confidence in what I've done. And so it's the same when you're interviewing. You're basically just taking a brief snap of what you did and you're giving the highlights of it and then just opening it up. It's kind of a practice that we call don't keep selling beyond the sell. Once you kind of put the hook out there, that's enough information for me to ask, oh, tell me more about that. What kind of searches were you working on? Were you leading those searches? When did you start leading them? When people are starting to ask those questions, we like to consider that the buy-in. They're starting to lean in on this. When you get to when someone's leaning in on a conversation with you, when you're interviewing, you're now in the kind of the power position. So give them what they want, and that will continue to get them drawn in. The last kind of part was in 2012, I decided I wanted to leave Washington, D.C., where I moved after New York. Wanted to work with earlier stage companies. I've been doing Fortune 500 search for 3 years at that point. It's been a great run, but working with massive companies and trying to measure your value and the impact of your work when you really can't tangibly see it is kind of a hard way to kind of justify every morning when you wake up what you're doing. And so what's a better place to go to work with early stage companies than San Francisco? And how did I end up at my firm? I wanted to go boutique. I wanted to be small. I'd always been at a larger firm, and I wanted to be able to really work closely with CEOs and founders. So I chose my firm, and we're 25 people. Just again there, I kind of gave you A, my motivations for leaving, B, a little bit more about me and what brought me out here, C, what I really like to do, which is to work with early stage companies, and lastly, also, I like to be a partner. So I'm not just trying to go work with cool tech or anything like that, but I'm actually giving a glimpse into what matters to me. And so it's the same thing again. In under a minute, I can give you enough into me about what really matters, but at the same time, I'm not dwelling on it. I'm not trying to overtell a story or go beyond really what anybody's looking for at that point. And then to kind of close this piece, and then we can kind of talk about how you guys want to do it, or really whatever you want to talk about. I've been at Kindred now for 5 years. I actually joined as an associate, having already been a director at a larger firm, because I wanted to prove myself. And then within a year, I was promoted to principal. Within 2 years, I was promoted to partner. I've been a partner now for 2 years. I built one practice within the firm, and I am currently building out a couple of more. And so that kind of piece right there, just kind of, it's the same type of thing. Or what practices are you building out? What are your areas of interest? I have a particular interest in cybersecurity. Within 30 seconds, again, I kind of summarized 5 years of my life. And so what anybody that was listening to that would say is, wow, he got there and he got promoted twice within 3 years. He made partner, and now he's building out a practice area. Again, it's just enough to get somebody interested to ask and want to learn more. And then you're in the position of really giving them the information that they need, and you can control the dialogue. And that's what good interviewing is. It's just controlling the conversation in a way that the other party is getting the information that they need, and that you're able to provide that information on your own terms. And so a lot of times people are saying, well, I walk out of the conversation and I didn't get to share this, or they didn't feel they get a good understanding of that. And the main thing there is you have to kind of look, okay, well, you had 30 seconds to answer a question. How did you answer it? Did you just spend too much on one piece versus another? Those are the key things that make people really good at interviewing. So that's kind of just a good general format to start with. I'm happy to answer specific questions or broader questions, but I kind of open it up to everybody. What can I tell you? Sure.
I have a question about kind of humility during an interview and what its role is. I mean, you're obviously trying to market yourself and sell yourself. Where's the fine line of that, and confidence?
Oh yeah, my question is around the role of humility in interviews, and where the fine line is between being confident and overly confident, or even bragging during an interview.
Yeah, so It's a great question, and it's actually something that one of my partners brought up to me actually a couple months ago when I was thinking about just how I told my story and when I'm pitching business. There is a fine line. The thing is this, is that the facts of your life are the facts of your life. What you've done in your professional career is what you've done. So I would, as long as you're not doing it in a manner that makes you come across as egotistical or makes you come across as selfish or really focused on yourself, you should praise your accomplishments. You accomplish them. And that's what we want to hear. We want to hear about your success. And so I think that, really what's most important is that you're concise. It aligns to really what the objectives of the business was and what you were looking to achieve, and then what those outcomes were. Because then it's not about just you. It's about what the business needed and how you built something to get it there. And that's what anybody wants to hear, from CEO to any C-level executive that's looking to hire below them, is they want to know how you help advance a business and that your focus is the business and not on personal gain.
How is interviewing for your first executive position different than maybe more senior ones?
So you're unproven. So you have to kind of convince whoever the interviewer is, be it a search firm and they're interviewing you for maybe an early stage company, kind of a first time head of a function, to the CEO. You have to convince them that you're ready. And so that's obviously easier said than done. The main things there is that you have to show that you have the business in mind for what you do versus the product in mind. I think that's kind of the major differentiator that really people do not think about enough when they make that next step, because in a leadership role, it's not just your function, it's not just your product, it's the business, and that's a lot of collaboration across other functions to move forward at the same speed. In product, it's engineering and marketing. Those are kind of the key ones there. Sales, it's marketing all the time. So what they're going to really look for is that you have demonstrated the ability to propel the business forward and that you're business minded. And so there's other aspects to it, but that's kind of the key piece. The second aspect of it is that you've started to demonstrate the ability to create scale. So it's not possible in most cases for someone who's a single IC to take a step into a director or VP role where they might be managing 10 people right off the bat. But if you are a director and you want to get to that VP role and you have built a team of 5 to 7 people below you, there's companies that are right for you. It's just being realistic about what those companies are today. It might mean taking on some more risk and going to an earlier stage company and being that first head of a function and trying to be successful from there. It might mean just staying on the path that you are and with your current company and really understanding what does that path look like for you? Are there roadblocks? Is there a VP already in that role who's not going anywhere? Understanding your situation, right? But to make that transition, you have to demonstrate that you can do the job, or at least you're 80 to 90% of the way there, and grit, willing to work, roll up the sleeves, do the work, maybe willing to take on some risk and go earlier to get into that role. Those are the best channels to do it.
Okay, I got called back to be the runner, so other questions? I'm gonna follow you with the mic.
Hi, Chris. I'm Colleen. And I was actually recruited by your firm fairly recently, which was great. And it was my first time. And my questions that I didn't ask at the time, but I had a great experience, came in second for the job, though. It's when working with a recruiter, how much are you our advocate? Like, how much can we ask of you in terms of information around the company, like org charts, roadmaps, understanding what the CEO or whomever is the hiring manager is looking for, helping us to understand where our experience how our experience fits to that. Like, how much can we depend upon you or rely on you to guide us to success?
All of it. Our job is to essentially help companies identify right people, and that is only successful if those people are bought into that company. And so everything you just described are key aspects of what it takes to make that decision, to be willing to make a life change. And that's what changing jobs is. And so it's our job to help facilitate that. We'll facilitate all of that information as long as we're allowed to. In certain aspects, like if you wanted to better understand the cap table or like what the current valuation of the company is, we will more likely than not direct you to the CEO. We will also let that person, that CEO know, hey, this person needs this information, and we'll start to demand it of them. So we'll advocate for you that to get this person across the finish line, this is what they need. So 100%, like that's the only way these are gonna be successful. If there's certain information we're just simply not allowed to share, we'll tell you. There's nothing that does us like any good to keep things in the dark. Just ask. I say that's the biggest thing. Most people don't ask.
Okay.
You sound like you have.
Okay, so we have a question.
Hi, Chris. I'm B. So, I read a lot of articles, and they say like don't share your current compensation with the prospect employers or recruiter. But my experience is when I work with a recruiter, they always ask how much you're making now, and as much as I talk around, well, this is my expectation, they'll kind of pin you down and ask. Otherwise, they wouldn't work with you. So what's the right way to approach that? Do you always ask the candidates for their current compensation, and would you work with them if they don't tell you?
So I don't. My firm doesn't. We do at the right time, which is typically when both parties are mutually interested and this is becoming serious. That's when it's a more appropriate time because, to be honest with you, compensation shouldn't be on the table until both parties are, like to describe, falling in love. Other firms don't do that necessarily. A lot of them will ask it up front. They might be asked to by their clients and they're not pushing back on it. So I can't speak industry-wide on that. The reason that we ask later is because if compensation comes in early, it's a distraction, and it also takes away from really what we're looking to do, which is to find the right fit. Plus, in venture-backed companies, you're not going to make a ton of cash anyway, so you're really betting on the long term, so you kind of have to be a believer. And for the most part, as I mentioned, a lot of this is benchmarked. So if you're making $1 million a year in cash and you're thinking of going to a Series A company, like you should be pretty self-aware at that point that you're not going to be getting nearly that much money and that you're making a big bet. I personally don't think comp is an important thing until really later in the conversation. And for the most part, it's a good search professional's job to understand what somebody probably is making at a company just based on its stage. That's what we do. So I can't speak for other firms, obviously, but it's more appropriate to have that conversation later, and I'll push back on my companies if they want to have it early. I have a CEO who he's a very good friend of mine. I actually invested in his company, and every single time I introduce him to somebody, he asks what the comp is, and I tell him literally to stop every single time. And I don't give him the answer. But for the most part, the reason being is because I don't want him to get as much shell shock as I want this person to feel that they're being self-selected out.
So, Chris, I'm going to just sort of jump in and sort of maybe help you out a little bit. So, let's just say hypothetically, I'm making $180,000, and then I get access to the benchmark data that says, on average for this role, it's $220,000. How do I bridge that gap, and should I be honest with how much I'm making? Is that sort of the?
If you're working with a search firm, like we're going to have that data, and if they're coming back under market, we're going to tell them. And at the end of the day, there is a little bit of kind of showmanship in there. You have to kind of be able to put out there, I'm willing to walk from it. Because if everyone else on average is making X amount of money for a Series A or Series B or whatever company, and the offer is below that, you need to fight back. And having that data helps, and we'll tell our companies. Now, there's going to be times, it happens pretty frequently, where companies have unrealistic expectations about what they're going to pay somebody, regardless of what data shows. And there's nothing you can do about that. I won't give the name of a particular company in New York that has raised a ton of money, but they made a CMO offer once at like 20 basis points to somebody that ended up going on and making millions with a normal package at a good, successful consumer company, and they couldn't understand why he wouldn't join. Well, that offer is the same that you'd give to like an individual contributor, like a Series A company. So there's going to be oddballs like that. There's going to be those types of situations. Use the data and push back, like be willing to walk away, because our job, if that really is the right fit, if you're that interested and they're that interested in you, we will get them there and we will push back on them. Or if they're just that outlandish, we'll be the one apologizing to you.
So I loved the way that you told your story, and it could be that you've just had that kind of success that builds upon success, or it could be that you've chosen those details. But for a lot of us, there are reorgs that happen, layoffs that happen, and especially women tend to not have as linear of careers as men. And so how do you advise for those of us who have more of these wandering paths, and sometimes it wasn't a choice to go from product A to product B within the same company because there was a reorg and that's just kind of what happened. How do you advise that we talk about the story in that same way where, because a lot of what you described was what was your motivation, why did you make this choice, and sometimes it isn't your choice, and sometimes you don't get the results that you'd like. And so how do you do that in a way that's both honest but doesn't hurt your chances?
There is no easy way. At the end of the day, those are the data points that people are going to look at on paper. What I would more advise is really evaluating where you want your career to go again. Because if you start to have a wandering path and you've had a couple of short stints and you're looking at your own resume and it's like, wow, there's been 3 or 4 jobs in the last 6-7 years. Where do you want to go? Is it, do I need to just continue to be a VP or a director, or do I want to go be a part of something successful? And maybe it's taking a lateral move. Maybe it's taking a slight step back to be a part of a great run and then kind of creating a new narrative for yourself. But it is a little bit of self-awareness. From where we're sitting, I have to be honest, we're going to look at that and be like flight risk, or we're going to look at that and be like this person's not mission driven or not aligned to their companies, despite the narrative. There's a couple ways to get around it, but they have to be really powerful, like great reference from Bill Gurley, something like that will help kind of quell those fears, but there is no easy way to do it. So it's really kind of what's most important. You could be the absolute best Series A of VP of product moving forward. And maybe that's just your mantra that you develop for yourself, and that's your story. And you're really good at 0 to 1, and you do it every year and a half. And that's the way you're going to take your career forward and own it. But to try and take the story and clean it up a little bit, it's not going to be easy, particularly for someone in my seat where I'm directly accountable for it. What you could do would be to try and network into something and try to kind of get early on something. Again, just own the career. That's really it. There is no easy way to own that narrative. I wish I had a better answer for you.
Okay, we can take one more question, and then we'll take sort of the last question here.
Oh, thanks. Okay. Pressure. Thanks so much for your time. This has been really helpful.
My pleasure.
So we're talking about, the analogy of dating, getting married. We're talking about building connection. And so you're in a position where you're not ready to move yet, but you do want to start, maybe not going on dates, but you want to start putting yourself out there. What's the best way to balance that where you're not necessarily a tease to folks, but you do want to start to get a feel for what's going on out there, what you maybe need to focus on in your next, project or what have you, or your next year, to be able to kind of help get you to that point where when you're ready, you're going to have a great narrative. So, I mean, do you actually go and do some interviews, or do you kind of how do you do that where you're not wasting anyone's time?
So the way to look at it, I think, is more along the lines of, are you just kind of trying to get a sense of the market, or do you have things that are unreconcilable in your job, and that you're kind of seeing them start to form now, but maybe in 6 months, maybe in a year, you'll be more ready. The major reason I ask that is because, if we have somebody that we introduce to 4 or 5 companies and they do a couple of meetings and then they never really follow through, we notice that. We note that down. Not that we don't think that person is not great. We think that person's fantastic, but we know that person likes to take a lot of meetings and isn't going to really follow through. So if you're going to start to take meetings, it has to be more than just general curiosity, I think. There has to be something that's either reconcilable at your job, that you need to see what else is out there to know that, or something that's just clearly not going to work for you. When we were actually, Han and Deb and I were all talking beforehand, one of the things she mentioned is that it's either maybe a manager or you just don't like the direction of the company. Those are non-reconcilable things. You need to go do something else, and it's just really coming to grips with that versus the product that you're trying to launch is just moving slow, or engineering is just being a pain about trying to get something done, right? Those are reconcilable things and not reasons to really raise your hand. We always ask, why are you looking? Why would you consider something? 95% of the time, most people aren't looking, and we're trying to drag them to the table. Where that changes is where you're constantly taking our calls and constantly taking a meeting, and then there's no real sound reason why you're not following through. And that's typically because you're not really facing anything that's non-reconcilable. So the best way to really kind of decide should you take meetings is there something that you foresee just not working out? And it makes a lot more sense to go see what other companies look for or what's out there versus just perusing the market.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Chris, again, for your time. We're going to... Thank you.